Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from Palo Alto, California. This is Doug Brunke, CEO and founder of Global Chamber. We've got a really exciting program today because many companies want to penetrate the market in Japan, but it's not always something that they see success with. And so we have a couple speakers today who are experts on how to penetrate the Japanese market successfully. Our first speaker is Dominic Carter. He is the founder of the Carter Group in Tokyo. They're a member in the city of Tokyo, but they work across Japan. They work primarily with foreign companies working to get in Japan. And you'd certainly know many of their clients. I'll let him speak more to it, but you would know almost all of their big name clients. They really do some great work. And Dominic, really appreciate you coming here to Palo Alto. He's on a tour of the U.S. right now before he heads back to Japan. So the timing was really good to meet here at Squire Patton Boggs' office in Palo Alto, California. Dominic, thanks for sharing more about your expertise and tips on how companies can grow in Japan.
Thank you, Doug. Well, it's a pleasure to be here early in the morning in Palo Alto. So today, if we can just get the slides up. The presentation today is called Ringing in the Age of Reiwa, and many of you will be aware that we've had a change in emperor in Japan, and last week was the enthronement of the new emperor. And as human beings, we love to set these turning points. You know, they may be arbitrary or they may be meaningful, and time will tell whether the new age of Reiwa is really a turning point for Japan or not. But certainly it's a good time to take stock of where we are, look at what the mega trends in Japan that are creating, I believe, some really interesting opportunities, and sort of look at what that might mean for US businesses moving forward in that market. So next slide, please. Okay. So today, I'm going to start off just by talking about some of the very big picture demographic dynamics in Japan, because as I mentioned, these are creating some very interesting opportunities. I'm going to run through quite briefly what I think are 4 key megatrends in Japan that are going to affect opportunities, and then a discussion of where does the US fit into this in terms of the opportunities for American brands. Next slide. So now Japan is a modern country, but in many ways it's a traditional society as well. So some of the things that we have, for better or worse, moved on from in Western society are still very important in Japan, or still present in Japan. So up until very recently, it's been quite normal, for example, for women after they marry not to work and to be homemakers. And so when you're marketing to Japanese, traditionally we've had in mind this homemaker target. As people also know, there's a very large older population in Japan as well, and that's quite well known. I think it's fair to say, though, that if you actually look at the figures, you'll see that the pressures that are on Japan as a society probably haven't been seen before in any society in the world. Next slide. So when we talk about turning points, on the left-hand side, this is called the demographic pyramid. It's basically a graphical representation of the population, looking at the percentage of the population, different age groups. On the left here, we have 1989, which was when the last emperor came onto the scene, and now we have 2019, which is this year where we've changed the emperor. So there are 2 key things. There are 2 key bulges in Japan's population. The first is the Dankai, or the baby boomers. They were born just after the war, and then the baby Dankai, who are the children of the baby boomers. And these are both very large population cohorts. The Dankai, or the baby boomers, have driven huge amounts of consumption in the Japanese economy post-war. And now they are getting much, much older. So they'll be very soon getting into that kind of elderly age group. And this is going to be a very, very interesting thing to watch, and will, of course, create opportunities for businesses that are targeting that. But in a sense, the more interesting part, possibly, we've talked a lot, everyone talks a lot about the aging population in Japan, but the really interesting part, if you look at it, is how few young people there are. And this is generally seen as being a matter for great concern, which it is. But of course, when there's fewer younger people, there's more scarcity value there. So anybody who's hiring people in Tokyo at the moment, and our firm is included in that, is having a very, very hard time trying to convince younger people to join. And salaries are going up. And if you are young in Japan and you're looking for a job, really the situation is very much on your side. Next slide, please. So really, a different lens of looking at the population structure in Japan is that, yes, there are a lot of older people, but it really is the scarcity of younger people that's changing everything. And I think in many ways creating some huge opportunities. And the opportunities are huge because the country is so wealthy. There is a lot of money in Japan, and there's very few young people in the society compared to what there used to be. Next slide. So this is a chart that shows the job opportunities to applicant ratio here. So in 2019, there are 160 jobs available for every 100 job applicants. So it really is a seller's market for labour, and you can see how that has really turned around since the global financial crisis. It's a really, really very strong labour market if you are looking for a job right now. So what does that mean, practically speaking? It means that you are going to be able to command a very good salary. If you are a native-born, educated Japanese young person, you will be able to command good money, and this makes you a very, very interesting consumer for a lot of different types of companies. Next slide. So we're really tied into that. We are dealing, the first mega trend here is the changing world of work. There's a huge labour shortage in Japan. There is no clear solution to it. Women coming into the workforce in record numbers. Robots, to some extent, are being talked about, but the practicalities of that also remain to be seen. And there is imported labour all being engaged, but it's very, very hard to bring imported labour up to speed in Japanese society quickly. But also at the same time, attitudes to the workaholic ideal and being tied to an office and being tied to a company are changing. Next slide. So this is a survey that we do every year in our firm, which is a market research firm, so we do a lot of surveys. But 60% of the Japanese consumer base is saying that they know that Japan's working habits need to change. It's hard to explain to people that don't live and work in Japan just how, in some respects, kind of crazy the working culture in Japan is. People will routinely work until 11, 12 o'clock midnight, take the last train home, come in and do it all again. And it's very, very hard to change those ingrained habits. There's a lot of social pressure on people to work like that. But younger people are different in the way that they think about this. Next slide. And the government is also quite worried about this as well. So they have recently introduced an initiative called Premium Friday. The headline here says you can enjoy a leisurely and luxurious weekday afternoon of blah shopping. So one Friday a month, the government is encouraging people to take time off and just get away from the office. Usually, where I come from in Australia, people don't need much encouragement to get away from the office, but in Japan, it's a big thing, and it's proving very hard to get people to go along with that. Next slide. The second area is women power. The next chart, I'll show you. If we can just go on to the next chart. So here we can see the black line is Japan's female labour participation rate. And you can see that it's actually in recent years has exceeded the US rate, which is really, really interesting. If we can look at the next slide. What we'll see, I hope everyone can see that, but there's a red arrow there looking at Japan. This is the share of employed people who are managers by gender. So that little red right-hand bar where we've got that arrow on Japan, you can see is absolutely tiny, minuscule. So what we're looking at in Japan is that women are starting to get into the workforce en masse more than they have in the past, but they're still not managers. So they have no, in a sense, their power is not what it would be compared in other countries. So Japan is behind the curve on that. Next slide. However, I think it's very likely in years to come that the balance of power economically is going to be upturned in Japan. So traditionally, women do control the household finances, but they have not been the breadwinners. And we are going to see more and more that women are going to have more of their own money to spend and more freedom in how they spend it. And this is going to have very wide-ranging implications for society, but also for marketers that are looking to sell into the market. Next slide. So here's an example. So I don't know if people are familiar with the idea of kawaii, but kawaii is a very common word that you hear in Japan, and it's like an infantilized cuteness. It's like it's a major theme in Japanese aesthetics and culture. So the car on the left here, which is a Daihatsu, was the Mira Coco, right? And so you can see it's very pink, it's very girly, it's very cute. It's actually, I kind of think it's kind of kawaii, I guess. That's what you would call kawaii. Now, their sales were precipitously dropping. So the guys at Daihatsu were thinking, what do we do? What do we do? Well, some of the girls at Daihatsu came over and said, guys, look, this is ridiculous. We want a car that looks more like the one on the right. So the car on the right, the Mira Cocotte here, that is a car that was actually designed by women, for women. So you can see how, you know, even with the way that things look, you know, when men sort of get out of the way a little bit and women start to have a bit more influence, that it gets a bit different. Next slide, please. Also, we've had a long-term trend, really ever since the global financial crisis of premiumization in Japan, where we take everyday items and they get branded and they get, you know, premiumized. So, you know, you can buy a $10 chocolate in Tokyo. It's quite easy to do that. And of course, that's crazy. It's $10 for a chocolate, but it's only $10. So it's a chance for some indulgence there. But I do think that as women earn more and gain more control of their money, that there is going to be a long-term continued trend in premiumization. And you can see even Kit Kat, for example, has been elevated to the high-end department store channel. So very, very interesting to see that. Next slide. The next area, of course, generational dynamics. I was showing you the demographic pyramid there. Japan is the most aged country in the world, and those generations may or may not have common interests. I think that, like, the way that generations work together in Japan, I think presents a lot of opportunity in a lot of areas. But, you know, when we ask people about we can go to the next slide. When we ask people what concerns, we've got 2/3 of people saying, yes, that Japan's aging society is a concern here. That's pretty much the top concern that people have. Next slide. Just some examples. I mean, I could sit here for an hour and give you examples of how people are responding to this in Japan, but Aeon is a very large shopping centre chain. Old people in Japan start their day a lot earlier than most other people, so they're opening earlier. They're giving health checkups. There's exercise space and sessions. It's actually a social hub because people like to meet at the shopping centre. And of course, you've got curated products targeted for seniors. You'll also see the convenience store channel. A number of the players in convenience stores are also orienting their business more towards older people. Convenience stores being located very close to where people live, have a big opportunity to meet that need. Next slide, please. You know, there are a lot of I used to think 65 was old, but you know, it's very, very normal to see 65-year-olds in Japan using smartphones and using an app called Line, and this is only going to increase. Of course, e-commerce is very convenient because people sometimes can be mobility limited, but there are good opportunities in e-commerce for seniors, and there are, you know, websites and so forth which are targeted directly at seniors and enhanced services. Next slide. And somewhat interestingly, there are also the grandparents and the very younger generation tend to have an interest in each other as well. So businesses like Toys R Us are looking at, well, how do they turn retail into an experience? How does that work across generations and so forth? And how can we engage older people and younger people in this case in play? Next slide. And finally, the last mega trend is internationalization. We just got the latest figures out on numbers of foreigners that live in Japan or people born overseas. That's at a record high. We're just at the final of the Rugby World Cup, which has been a really great tournament so far. A lot of people getting into that sport in Japan, but of course we have the big one next year, which is the Olympic Games, and the 64 Olympics for Japan was a turning point, and you never know, like next year's Olympics may be a turning point as well. Next slide. But certainly when you go into a convenience store in Japan now, you're just as likely to encounter a Chinese person at the register, or an Indian person, or a Nepalese. This is not, of course, not uncommon for the last 50 years in Western countries to have recent immigrants working in corner shops and convenience stores, but it's new for Japan, and it reflects the changing face of Japan's labour force, and there will only be more of this over time. Next slide. Huge opportunity in Japan is what they call integrated resorts. They are planning to build three resorts around the country. The law is still being kind of worked on. There's lots of things that need to be sorted out there, but huge investment is going to be made in these resorts. They are going to include casinos, but the casinos are only a very small part of the footprint of the resort, so there'll be shopping, there'll be entertainment, so on and so forth. And there are a lot of companies at the moment who are looking at the Japanese market from an integrated resort perspective. So very, very interesting developments there. And, you know, as we speak, the political process is moving forward on that. Next slide. And of course, Japanese retail concepts. Nintendo Tokyo is opening very soon. But of course, they started in New York. So Nintendo New York opened before Nintendo Tokyo. So it's very, very interesting to see how the Japanese concepts are also being exported, and also that interaction is coming back into the market in Japan, presumably for also an international audience as we have the Olympics and so forth. So we can see Uniqlo also expanding overseas and so forth. So Japanese retail in general is becoming more internationalized. Next slide. So how In terms of the context of Japan's internationalization, how well placed could we say US businesses? So next slide. So there are really, a wide range of well-loved American brands in Japan. This is a question we asked on our survey, and what are your favorite American brands? Apple comes on top. iPhone has got extremely good penetration in Japan. Google is also very popular. Then Amazon, Coke, Microsoft, Nike, McDonald's. And then, some smaller fashion and luxury brands, Coach, Ralph Lauren, and Tiffany. So the major American brands definitely do have a presence in Japan and are an important part of the consumer's consideration set in the categories where they're in. Next slide. This is our survey. Again, we're looking at opinion towards US brands. We took this measurement in 2017, 2018, and 2019. And you can see that the people who, the percentage of the market that have a strongly favourable or somewhat favourable attitude towards American brands is actually increasing year on year. There is some impact of the Trump administration on the way that brands, I'm not going to get into it in this presentation because it's too detailed of a topic. However, the initial nervousness that people had around the Trump administration has somewhat come off the boil. So I think there's a much more favourable and tranquil relationship there, and we've got the free trade agreement, which has been announced recently as well, which comes into that. So it is actually a favourable and increasingly favourable situation for US brands. Next chart. Here is a chart that shows what are the market's preferred destinations for international travel. So we can see US is number one, and year on year between 2018 and 2019, 2019 is the red bar, 2018 is the grey bar, that the US has actually increased its favourability as a destination. The other market that has increased is Taiwan. Other markets like Italy, Australia, France, Great Britain, Spain, have decreased in their favourability. So America is taking sentiment from the other countries. So very, very good picture for US tourism. Next chart. And this is a chart. I'm sorry, there's a lot of numbers on the chart, but simply saying that there are opportunities also among younger people, especially people in their the teens, 20s and 30s, in fast food and restaurants. So food is a big area of opportunity in Japan. And in that fast food and restaurant space, as you can imagine, America has a very good positioning in restaurants and fast food in that area, and young people are very, very open to that. Next slide. So what could we say is a recipe for success for US business in this age of Reiwa? Next slide. Well, there are four areas where we think Japan's megatrends kind of synergistically come together. The first is convenience, second is experience, third is wellness, and fourth is culture and design. And I'll just talk very briefly about each of those. So next slide. Convenience is something that was always really thought of in terms of the salaryman. So if you look at something like canned coffee, that's a typical salaryman targeted product. But of course, now women have enhanced roles in their work and career. There are different elements of convenience that are coming to the fore. And seniors want bothersome chores taken away from them, especially the seniors that we have now, because they were, the baby boomers. So they're not old in their minds, these guys. Next slide. Experience. Any experience category in Japan, any experience category is going to have a very, very good run in Japan in years to come. Yes, this can be retail. People have more time. There's more e-commerce. People may not be working as many hours. They're going to be paid more. This is going to have implications in terms of retail and concepts here. And of course, the need for experience goes well beyond retail into leisure and entertainment. Next slide. Wellness, wellness is a nascent trend in Japan, and people have fast-paced lives, but they're also more disconnected. So as we become kind of digitalized and in some respects alienated from traditional wisdom and so on and so forth, wellness comes in to meet the problems that come from that, and that's true in America, and it's also true in Japan. And of course, seniors are very health obsessed as well. So seniors have very high standards, for example, in terms of the food that they eat. So they want actually more higher quality foods than, say, younger people are eating. And so, for example, convenience stores are looking at the way that they set up their range to have options that are suited towards seniors. Next slide. Then culture and design. Okay, so, and this is not just in Japan, of course, but in today's world as well, brands that want to establish interest and status for themselves do use culture and design in order to do so. And what's assumed will connect to typical Japanese being thrown out the window and creating a lot of opportunities for international players to come in and put forward their concepts and their ideas. There's a very open and interested market in Japan for that. So next slide. And so this is a build. So again, we could talk for a very long time on what all of the opportunities are, but if we look at world of work, so what are we looking at? So recruitment tech is a huge area. Recruitment is a huge area in general, but tech related to that, to better curation of jobs for job seekers and everything to do with recruitment tech is very, very interesting. Shared workspaces. We have a WeWork around the corner from us in Tokyo. It's very expensive, but there are a lot of other competitors who've come up in the shared workspaces area as well. So it's not just led by WeWork. There are a lot of players there. Management consulting, of course, in terms of world of work. How do we, transform workplaces that have very entrenched cultures, workplace cultures that don't really work for the people that work in them? And then, of course, everything related to lifestyle around world of work. So if you look at where new retail concepts are being opened up, they're not only in the traditional areas where people would go on the weekend, because people might have time off during the week, and so on and so forth. So there is different, different elements of things that you put in around people's lifestyle become relevant when the world of work is changing. Next. So women power, again, in the world of work, of course, being suited to making the workplace suitable for women is absolutely huge. So management consulting, diversity in Japan pretty much is about women at the moment. That's when people talk about diversity, that's what people are generally talking about. But we can look to premium categories. It's not luxury like it was in the 80s, where people would spend huge amounts on leather handbags and so forth. But it is more what I was referring to earlier about premiumization. When women have their own money, they're going to want to treat themselves sensibly to things. And that creates opportunities where we might not have seen those before. Food is huge. So if you look at semi-prepared food, all types of deli food, so on and so forth, huge opportunities there. Huge opportunities also in fresh food in Japan. And the countries that are best positioned for fresh food are Australia and New Zealand at the moment, followed by the US. The US does have some work to do in terms of lifting its image there. Anything experiential as well, that's targeted to especially women or built with women in mind will do well. Next, internationalization, tourism, inbound and outbound. There's huge potential for tourism, integrated resorts, and also English training, but not the traditional English training. More digitalized training and more advanced tools and so forth. There are opportunities. And lastly, next slide here, generational dynamics here. So aging tech is huge. In fact, our firm is working at the moment with a company that works in robotics in terms of helping some of the tasks around caregiving. Wellness is huge. Beauty and skincare, you can imagine as people age, people who've always had an interest in the way that they look will be much more interested in newer and better ways to look after themselves, and also in the financial sector. The financial sector is very, very underdeveloped in Japan. So people are used to just putting their money in the bank and getting very little interest on it. So that's what I had planned to present today. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dominic. We've got a lot of questions coming in. Send them into the chat area or email them to info@globalchamber.org. We now are going to shift over to Kirsty Wilkinson. So I don't think we had this all figured out, but Kirsty is in Melbourne, Australia. So we have two Australian-based people born in Australia as experts of Japan. And in addition to Dominic, I can say in Kirsty's case, she had worked for a Japanese liquor company and was very successful there, and she's about as expert as you can be on liquor, and that expertise has gone well beyond that, and so I think you're really going to enjoy her conversation. She's been recorded because of the time zone difference between there and Palo Alto, and so here she is.
Hi, Caesar and Global Chamber members. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about doing business in Japan. There are two things that I often talk about with potential clients, one being mindset and the other investing time and money. So why mindset? Mindset is really important because you need to be willing to learn about a little bit about the Japanese culture and also the language as well. Recently, I've spoken to quite a number of businesses interested in exporting to Japan. There are two particular businesses I'm thinking of. One is a winery and also a Manuka honey drinks company. We've had quite a lot of discussions with the winery over time, and recently I met with myself and another Japanese company who I'm going to be collaborating with on this client. One of the things that really came to light was around their mindset about exporting to Japan. A lot of businesses think that if they've exported to other countries, then they'll be able to succeed in Japan. This isn't always the case. Doing business in Japan is very different to other parts of the world. This winery has been very successful in China, and I think he assumed that because he'd been successful in China, he'd be successful in Japan. China and Japan are very different in their cultures and also the way they do business. When we approached the winery about needing to understand about the culture and also be willing to adapt as needed, they were a bit, they're a bit half and half about whether they needed to do that. They felt that they knew some of it. They thought that listening to us that they knew how to do things, but we reiterated to them that it's very different doing business in Japan and that a lot of Japanese people don't speak English, so it's imperative to have an interpreter involved in meetings and that a translator is involved with getting any documentation translated into Japanese. After the meeting, we had the Japanese company and I had some discussions, and We are still talking to the client, but one of the things that we will be talking to them further about is the mindset, because unless they're willing to change the way they think about doing business in Japan, they may need to consider whether they actually enter the Japanese market and whether that's really a market for them. I also recently met with a drinks company that make honey water and also iced tea with Manuka honey. They were very interesting and were better in the way they listened to what we had to say. However, they still had a few blocks about changing things if they needed to in the Japanese market. They've been successful in some other markets and looking at other markets, but one thing that sometimes that you need to do, sometimes there might be an ingredient that's not allowed in certain countries, and sometimes it's about changing that. For example, it might be a sweetener. For example, in some countries there might be a particular sweetener that's not allowed, and they might need to replace it with something else. Again, they were a bit reluctant to do that, but I think they understood that if they were going to be successful, they needed to do that. I'd also like to talk about investing time and money. Usually we have a couple of meetings with potential clients before talking to them further about investing time and money into exporting to Japan. It's been very interesting in the last couple of weeks. I've spoken to the honey drinks company, the winery, and most recently with a big US alcohol company. And a lot of the time, companies want to take shortcuts and try and spend less money. That doesn't work in the Japanese market. You can't afford to take shortcuts. We had one business who just wanted to pay us commissions, and I explained to them that doing a market research piece, first of all, looking at where they wanted to, what kind of customers, clients they wanted to target, where they wanted to sell their product. For example, did they want to sell it in, for example, for the winery, did they want to sell into hotels, bars, wine bars, restaurants, department stores, specialty wine shops? All of that needs to be decided. And also, to start with, it's better to just look at a few products, not the whole range. And in having discussions with the winery, when I met with the Japanese company as well, they seem to want to take shortcuts and not spend the money that they really need to spend. If a company is not willing to spend the time and invest time and money into the early stage of the process, there's really no point in them taking that further. I also will be taking on a new client whose direct selling business is going into Japan next year. She has an amazing mindset and understands that she needs to learn about the Japanese culture and some Japanese language and doing business in Japan for her to be successful in the Japanese market. She understands that it's important to invest time and money in order to be successful in the Japanese market. She was also keen to do a trip to Japan where I showed her some more traditional parts of Japan, and so she can learn more about the Japanese market for skincare, and so that she can learn more about the Japanese culture, because it's very different studying in your own country to actually going to a country and actually practicing some of the language that you've learned. So I want to thank you very much for listening in, and I hope that this has been useful. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email at kirsty@asiamarketmakers.com, or Caesar can also put you in touch with me. Thanks for your time.
Hi there. I've unmuted ourselves here in Palo Alto. So because of the time zone difference, Kirsty was recorded. So as she mentioned, if you'd like to get a hold of her, please let us know or directly contact her. Happy to have that connection there. So I'm really going to be sitting here with Dominic for the next few minutes. We've got about 18 minutes for your questions, so please send them into the chat room or send them to info@globalchamber.org. And Dominic, we have a number of questions already. So the implications then of what's happening in Japan, I thought what you put together was really excellent in terms of a summary. Kirsty talked a little bit about market research and understanding the Japanese market, and given that there's so many things changing there, especially given the dynamics you talked about. How should companies look at the country? Should they go there and spend time and spend a few weeks and just absorb it? Tell us more about how you've gotten probably to the mindset of understanding of the Japanese basic foundational understanding, but then beyond that, there's things changing. So how does a company, they're not going to sit there in the country for the years that you spent there. No. So how does a company, whether it's Coke that you work with, or whether it's some of the other companies, how do they get into the swing of it and be able to tap into some of these dynamics that you talked about?
Yeah, I think it helps to physically visit, because everything is very, very different. Let's say if you are a company that sells household products or products that are meant to be used inside the home, it is a very, very good idea to go and look at some Japanese homes, because they're very different to American homes. They're a lot smaller, but just the way people put their houses together is different. I know that we've all heard about Japanese minimalism, but it does not exist in Japanese houses. They are very cluttered. They're not always messy, but there's a lot of stuff in a small space. So kitchens are very small. So it's a very, very good idea to spend some time with people who your target buyer is, whether it's B2B or B2C or whatever it is. So oftentimes when we work with clients that are coming into the market, we will advise them to do what we call an ethnography project, which will involve us going out into home or into people's environment, or going to the restaurants where they eat, or the pools where they exercise, or whatever it is that we need to do. Spend time with them. Just what you observe, and we invite our clients to come along with us on that on those exhibitions as well. You learn a lot just by looking around you.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So the women in Japan clearly is a mega trend, right? Mm-hmm. So the word diversity you mentioned really means women.
Yeah.
And I presume it means women as consumers. It means women in the workplace as well. And so some of the specific implications we gathered were that maybe some of the older ways that women were perceived as buying some of these luxury items, that it's maybe shifting toward experiential type of things. And so that shift there, you mentioned about these integrated resorts, that I presume is an example of that type of experiential type of shift.
Yeah, and I think the thing with integrated resorts is that unless these businesses take into account the needs of women in the way that they design everything, they are not likely to be successful.
Okay.
there is actually a lot of resistance to the idea of gambling among women for reasons that you can understand. Traditionally, they've kept a very tight rein on household budgets, and so the idea that people are going to be going to casinos and so forth is causes some concern. But those concerns can be managed, and at the end of the day, the gambling space will only be a small part of the integrated resort. But nevertheless, unless the entertainment mix is one that reflects the changing status of women and the changing needs of women, again, I would say that it's probably unlikely to be successful, because women will be the key, in a sense, swing vote for groups to visit. So their influence is very, 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 very important.
Integrated results for integrated resort then means there's gambling, maybe for mainly the men, and then there's other things for women. Is that kind of what that means?
Well, traditionally, your average profile of a gambler in Japan is male and a little bit older, probably with a bit of life experience, you could say. But of course, why would you not create games around women? Why would you not create new activities that are gaming based for women? So the whole area of digital experience does actually create some really interesting opportunities to create new kinds of experiences.
Very interesting. So we have several questions, and so one of them is, what countries are being more successful entering the Japanese market based on what you've seen?
Oh, well, that's interesting. I think Kirsty's points are very, 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 very appropriate. There are a lot of companies that don't do their homework, and to some extent, the more successful they are in their home market and in other markets, the more danger they're in when they enter the Japanese market, because everything can work differently. So the assumptions are different. The things that drive the consumer are different, often in the category and so forth. But we see American companies coming in and doing very well, and American, European businesses, also some Australian businesses. But it really depends on the mindset. How open. So I don't see any particular bias in terms of the nationality there, but it's almost like a corporate, orientation. How open-minded are they? How open-minded are businesses to changing the way that they do things? That can be very challenging to change things. Like if it's food, yes, if you're used to selling cinnamon rolls in America, you probably have to make them a bit less sweet when you go to Japan. You'll have to change formulation in things like skincare and personal products. Generally, things are they're less strong in Japan. The Japanese people are very sensitive to chemicals and that sort of thing, even in cleaning products as well. So it's a matter of what is your mindset? Are you prepared to change what your approach? If you're going to come in and just do it the same way that you do it in every other market, including China, you're actually likely to fail. So Kirsty's right on the money on that. But the point being is that if you do your homework and you make the changes that you need to make, you can do very well out of Japan. It's actually a very, very lucrative market if you do get the formula right.
So you I think even worked with companies like Coke and Apple, and so those are products like the iPhone as an example, right? I think the iPhone is the iPhone and Coke is the Coke, right?
Yes.
So how do companies like that have kind of an iconic product shift?
Well, I think there's a few steps that you need to do. So of course you need to follow the rules of gaining trust. But if you look at iPhone as a product, that was an agenda reset. So it was in fact the Japanese that led in smartphones and in cellular technology. So in the early 2000s, we had iMode, which was a Docomo product. You had what they call the feature phones with the color screens and the web capability, and Apple came in and really reset the agenda in the categories. So if you have a product that would, if you bring it into the market, would cause the buyer to think differently about what's already on the market, rather than something just as like something, you know, that is a very well supplied category, then you're likely to have a good chance of being successful if you build your strategy right. So to be really, really successful, your product has to, or your brand has to create a reappraisal of what's currently in the market. Otherwise, Japan's a very well supplied market. So you really got to think about, if you've got a portfolio of products or brands, what is it that you come in and you can offer that will be different.
Okay.
But Coke's a great example of a company that does it differently in Japan. Like their biggest product is coffee, not Coke, not carbonated. It's coffee. So you know, and I guess, you know, it was a long time ago now, but they had to have the bravery to give that a go and do it differently in that market.
Huh. So market research, I think, is something that you guys do really well, right? So it sounds like market research needs to be part of that.
Absolutely.
Element.
So when you do market research in Japan, you have to do some work around the culture and some work around your category, mapping that out. So that's often, you know, what we call desk research or secondary research. And then, as I said earlier, I advise spending some time face-to-face, eyeball-to-eyeball with people before you even think about putting a survey together. You've got to immerse yourself in the market and really see how it works differently. And you'll understand a lot of things that you're being told by people when you've taken that step. So people always say, oh, you should do this in Japan, you can't do that. You know, sometimes it's true, but you definitely will have a much better perspective if you've spent some time with people.
Okay. Better to listen to them directly.
Yeah, really immerse yourself.
Kind of relates to the next question. Is there the same value in joining business associations in Japan as there is in the U.S.? Do you have a sense?
Oh, well, if you're an international company, absolutely.
Okay.
So there's a lot of mutual support that can be gained, and the organisations, of course, including Global Chamber, but you know, the American Chamber of Commerce in Japan is a huge organisation and has worked very, very hard on advocacy issues in terms of having the government to open up the market to more players.
So I don't remember this comment, but this is from Michael Tucker. Thank you, Michael. Good to hear from you. I'm glad you're listening. You mentioned, Dominic, that unique forms of English training are needed. Could he elaborate on what he means by unique? Who has he observed pursuing English education with intensity?
Yes, well, I mean, we're actually working with one of the major entertainment companies at the moment on English. Like, it's kind of interesting as who's thinking of getting into this area, but it's not like Japanese find it very hard to learn English. They study a lot and still struggle. And they have, you know, a lot of nervousness around speaking English and so forth. So I think it's not just about digitalization in terms of how the training is delivered. It's also about, you know, some kind of innovation in the core methods of teaching English as well. So I'm in no way an expert on that area, but I think there are always going to be huge opportunities to improve the way English education is done in Japan.
So the fact that the brand of the U.S. and I presume English-speaking countries is still improving, and so there's still a lot of interest in speaking English.
Oh, absolutely, and it's becoming more necessary.
So it's interesting when you were talking about international travel, U.S. being number one. You mentioned Taiwan increasing, Europe decreasing. You didn't talk about China. There's a lot of Chinese people in Japan.
Yes.
You know, how is that translating for Japanese in China?
Well, you know, I think that Japanese are in general not traveling as much as they used to.
Okay.
And you know, I think there is interest in visiting other Asian countries and China and so forth, but there have been issues as well politically which have died down in recent years. But I do think that the big other for Japan is always America. So there'll always be that kind of romance and attraction, and it's a little bit scary too to come to America. Japanese are nervous about traveling sometimes, but but America really is the big other, I think, for Japanese. And so I think that because like China doesn't have quite that pull, even though it's closer. So I think there's at an emotional level, I think that the US is very, very attractive. That doesn't mean that China is not attractive as well, but with the limited time that people have to travel, I think they probably prefer to go somewhere that really offers them more.
Great. Well, as an American, it's great to hear that that's continued, and so I've heard it said that to penetrate the Chinese market, particularly the Chinese luxury market, perhaps going into some of the department stores in Japan makes sense, given that there's the high number of Chinese visitors. So what's your feeling and sensibility around that kind of, hey, you can improve your sales in Japan, but you can also reach parts of China?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid idea, but I think it also stretches to, let's say, if you're an American brand, and you want to test the response or build a name up with Japanese, why don't you do something in Hawaii? Because there are so many Japanese in Hawaii. So I think those chances for people to sample and experience while they're on holidays is actually very, very potentially valuable.
So this is this is kind of related to the market for English trainers for Asians, and I think he's asking for Indian English instructors. So maybe how has, in this latest data, I noticed you referenced the data, the highest percentage and the highest number of foreigners living in Japan right now. It was just announced. How is India in terms of its dynamics? Is that increasing?
Well, very strong, very important in technology area. So there are numerous people coming from India who are working in the technology business in Japan, and of course it's going to be very, very important to find people who can code and do those sorts of things. So we do see increasingly more and more people coming to Japan from India to work, and will be very, very important, because the amount of work to be done, there just aren't the Japanese to do that, and they may not in fact have the same skill set that Indian people do.
So even though it's the highest ever, it's still only 2 to 3% of the total population.
Oh yes, it's still tiny. There's a huge way to go, but another very interesting statistic is we're losing 500,000 people a year in Japan every year. So you're having like a reasonably sized city. I don't know how many people live in Palo Alto, but it's probably more than that that are just disappearing out of Japan. So, and that's going to accelerate in years to come. So the population is shrinking, and to some extent that population is going to need to be replaced in some areas. I don't anticipate mass immigration into Japan, but certainly if you are thinking of living and working in Japan, there are going to be great opportunities to do so, especially if you have a skill that's in demand.
So there's 8 million homes in Japan that don't have inhabitants, which kind of goes to that point, is that the dynamics of population there is definitely on the downside. And so at some point, probably they'll start to welcome maybe foreigners.
Oh yes, I think it's happening. It's happening already, but it'll happen at a rate that I think suits the government and suits business. I think business is much more in favour of it, and the government has had to respond to that. But it's very controversial.
I bet, so as it is in most countries, exactly, except Australia. Or it's still even for some people.
Oh yeah, Australia is a very, very diverse place now, and I think we've really relied on immigration to keep our economy growing for the last 30 years. So
for the last hundreds of years, right?
Yeah, well, no, absolutely.
It's historic, just like the U.S.
Yeah,
relying
very much
on immigrants. So we've come to the end of our hour, sadly, because this is a topic that we could talk about for hours with an expert like Dominic, who's been, how long have you now lived in Japan?
21 years.
21 years, my Lord. Do you see yourself retiring there, or what's the future hold for?
Oh, you never know. I think Japan will always be a part of my life. There's no doubt about that. So,
fantastic.
Yeah,
so it's clear that you love the place, you know the place, and so between Dominic and Kirsty today, you heard two people that just love Japan, understand Japan, and so above and beyond everything else that you do, tactically, speak to people who really understand the market before you jump in. Kirsty was talking a little bit about that in terms of spending the time and money, presumably, to be able to do the research. But speak to people who know the market, and the chances for success will be a lot higher. So we're going to come to the end of our program today. We appreciate everybody around the world calling in. I saw that there were a couple more questions that we didn't get to, and we'll try to answer those offline. If you have other questions or you need to get a hold of one of the speakers, please let us know. Contact them directly, or info@globalchamber.org will find its way to them. Our next presentation is with the president of Thunderbird School of Global Management. That's next week, and he'll be talking about two very exciting programs for internationally minded people who want to be even more internationally savvy. And so we're really excited to be able for Dr. Sanjeev Kagram, who's actually from Palo Alto, of all places, to be speaking about the Thunderbird School of Global Management. Reach out at any time. We'll typically have one or two Globinars every week, and so we want to keep you fully engaged with international business. You need to be able to stay up on all the market changes. The changes that Dominic talked about for Japan, those are real time. They're happening right now, and so there's 195 countries. You can't possibly know everything with every single country, but there are certain countries that are very likely great for your products, and so consider Japan as one of those, and we've got some experts here to talk with you about it. Have a great day, good afternoon, good night, and good morning around the world. Take care. Yeah, thanks a lot.